Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone from around the world. My name is Rick Richman. I am a resident scholar at AJU. We have about 850 people registered for this webinar, which reflects the importance of the topic and the prominence of our speaker. Last year, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said Israel was in a war on 7 fronts: Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. This is the second of 7 webinars we're doing on the multi-front war against Israel, jointly presented by AJU and the Middle East Forum. Gregg Roman, the director of the forum, will be speaking today on the West Bank. 2 weeks from now, on Monday, June 3rd, we will have Daniel Pipes, the founder and president of the Middle East Forum, speaking on Gaza. Then we'll have different experts from the remaining fronts on the following 5 Mondays at this time, and you can register for some or all of them at aju.edu. Let me give a brief introduction of Gregg Roman, who doesn't need a long one. He's the Chief Operations Officer for the Middle East Forum. He previously served as a political advisor to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel, and he worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. He attended American University in Washington, D.C., and the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel, where he studied national security and political communications. In 2014, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency named him as one of the 10 most inspiring global Jewish leaders. I'm going to turn it over to Gregg for about 10 to 15 minutes to give his presentation on the West Bank, and then we'll have a brief colloquy between the two of us, and then we'll turn to questions that you may have, which you can put in your Zoom Q&A function. So Gregg, welcome, and we eagerly anticipate your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Rick. And it has been quite the weekend, with the death of the Iranian president, the foreign minister, senior officials from one of the most, I'd say, contentious regions in Iran. But even though that's not the subject of our talk today, it is a good backdrop, because you never know what's going to happen in the Middle East. And that's something that I would like to underline as the thesis for this conversation today. While most attention around the world has focused on the events in Gaza, the West Bank is no less a powder keg and no less dangerous to Israel's national security concerns than any of the other 7 fronts that it is currently fighting on. Over the last 8 months, the West Bank has experienced an unprecedented escalation in violence and military action, reflecting the broader concerns and tensions of the ongoing war in Gaza. The situation on the ground is complex, with multiple factors combining to the current crisis, including Iran's extensive involvement in arming and supporting jihadi groups like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other less well-known terrorist organizations in the West Bank. Today, I hope to explore a few things that have shaped the conflict in the West Bank since October of 2023, including Israel's extensive counterterrorism campaign, the toll on Israeli civilians, and the challenges faced by the IDF in protecting both Israel citizens and innocent Palestinians that are in the West Bank as well. I also want to delve into the role that Iran has in fueling the violence and examine Israel's justification for its actions in the West Bank. As always, any questions you have, I'd be glad to answer. I'm going to keep my remarks brief so that we can get to as many audience questions as possible. According to intelligence reports, Iran has established a sophisticated smuggling network spanning multiple countries, including Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel, to transport weapons into the West Bank. The scale of the operation is staggering. Israeli security forces have intercepted over 1,200 weapon shipments since October of 2023, including more than 7,500 assault rifles, 1,200 anti-tank missiles, 4,000 RPGs or rocket-propelled grenades, and over 500,000 rounds of ammunition. In March 2024 alone, the IDF and the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, were able to foil an attempt by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, that's the external overseas operating arm of the IRGC in Iran, to smuggle 20 tons of explosives and other weapons into the West Bank. Iran's involvement in the smuggling operation began before October 7th of 2023. In June of 2023, he ordered his forces to start smuggling or increase their smuggling of these types of weapons into the West Bank as part of the Iranian Ring of Fire strategy to encircle Israel with dangerous actors. The Iranian regime has funneled more than $200 million to Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad since the start of the conflict, enabling the groups to recruit new fighters, construct fortified positions, and carry out increasingly sophisticated attacks. The Israeli response has also met with new weapons being used to try to mitigate these terror attacks, and even the use of helicopters and airstrikes in trying to take out Palestinian terrorists operating from the 8 main Palestinian civilian centers throughout the West Bank itself. The results of both of these sides have been devastating. Since October 2023, Iranian-backed militants have carried out over 150 terror attacks in the West Bank, killing 4 Israeli civilians and many more soldiers, wounding over 300. The IDF has thwarted an additional 200 planned attacks. The threat remains high, with intelligence suggesting that between Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, having over 15,000 fighters under arms and tens of thousands of more weapons that are at their disposal. In response to the growing threat, the IDF has launched its largest counterterrorism campaign in the West Bank since Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. Over the past 8 months, Israel has conducted more than 3,000 raids and arrest operations targeting Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and also terrorists from the Fatah faction, which is associated with Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority. These operations have led to the arrest of over 5,000 suspected terrorists, including 2,300 from Hamas and 1,400 from Islamic Jihad. In addition, another 850 terrorists have been reported killed in clashes with Israeli forces, with the IDF reporting that 95% of those killed were armed combatants who fired on soldiers during raids. The IDF also has carried out high-level airstrikes against Hamas and Islamic Jihad commanders. Just in January 2024 alone, there was a major strike that took out the head of the Lion's Den in Jenin, which is a major terror faction comprising all of the different Palestinian militant groups. And in April, another strike was carried out, with an airstrike actually taking place over the weekend as well. The campaign has dealt a significant blow to terror operations and terror infrastructure in the West Bank. According to IDF estimates, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad have lost over 30% of their fighters and 40% of their arsenals since October of 2023. However, the groups remain active and continue to pose a serious threat, with the IDF intercepting an average of 20 weapon shipments and thwarting 10 planned attacks each month. Israel maintains measures in the West Bank that are necessary to protect its citizens from the threat of terrorism and also to disrupt these militant networks. Every possible precaution is taken by the IDF, with both the military and civilian governments running in play, and at the same time, making sure that Palestinians are trying to have ease of movement. However, this has taken an enormous toll on Palestinians in terms of their economic performance, with the Palestinian GDP suffering something like a 20% contraction, but also the cost to Israel has been high, with the estimated military campaign costing around $2 billion. Despite all these challenges, Israel stays on its toes. It's able to meet the threat. Just a few more notes that I would end with, Rick, before we get into questions. The first would be the threats to Israeli towns that are that are east of the Green Line. Major settlement blocks like Ariel, like Kiryat Arba, Ma'ale Adumim. Every day they have faced increasing threats, with either being rocks or shooting attacks or even attempted bombings. The threat there is no greater than it was back during the Second Intifada, but no less than it was during the knife intifada that took place a few years ago. The last point that I would end on is that there is increasing political pressure from Israeli civilians who live west of the Green Line and trying to figure out some sort of solution for these attacks which keep on going on, because Palestinian terrorism knows no borders. But at the same time, the political bloc, which is part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's government, led by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, are a major partner in his cabinet, and their concerns are addressed equally, if not more so, than those who are sitting in the opposition. Rick, over to you.
Thank you, Greg. Let's start with the concept of the day after, which is obviously what's monopolizing our attention in Gaza. But there's going to be a day after in the West Bank as well, because Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, is 88 years old, reportedly in poor health. He's in the 20th year of his 4-year term. And we don't know when he's going to leave the scene or under what circumstances, but like the next earthquake, you never know when it's coming, but every day it's one day closer. So there's going to be a day after when Mahmoud Abbas exits the scene in the West Bank. And as you've noted, there are a lot of Hamas and Islamic Jihad soldiers there already. Give me your thoughts about the day after that's coming in the West Bank. What's going to happen?
Well, there's two scenarios which are spoken about. One, which is an internal Palestinian Authority leadership succession plan, which would see possibly the Palestinian Minister for Civil Affairs, Hussein al-Sheikh, take over an interim authority. And then you would have a leadership struggle, which would take between 7 or 8 of the main top Palestinian Fatah leaders. This includes Tawfiq. This includes Jibril Rajoub and other well-known Palestinian leaders who serve as senior ministers or officials in the PA right now. And that would be, I think, the less democratic way to find a new leader of the PA. If the international community were to have its way, I'm not talking necessarily about the United States, but the European Union, Russia, and China, they would see elections take place in the West Bank and Gaza. And according to every single opinion poll that comes out in Palestinian society, a Hamas leader would be most likely to be elected as head of the PA. And I don't think necessarily now democracy is the way to go in the West Bank for leadership succession. So my take is Israel would probably go the less democratic of the two routes, only to enable that its security cooperation with the PA would continue. But the long game here is not to follow the current model. Just like Benny Gantz said a few days ago, he doesn't want Hamas and he doesn't want Abbas. That applies not just to Gaza, it also applies to the West Bank. And I think what you need now is a process of Palestinian devolution in terms of their civil rule and of their politics, and to rebuild it with a partner who would be willing to live side by side with Israel, somewhat hesitantly. But you have to basically do the same process you have in Gaza going on right now. And you have to get rid of the militant threat that exists east of the Green Line.
Well, particularly if you've got as many Hamas fighters as you have indicated that there are, that's probably more Hamas or Islamic Jihad fighters than are in Rafah right now or remain in Rafah. So you're talking about probably an operation at least as significant as the one that Israel's currently engaged in Rafah. To what extent is this issue on the table at the State Department, within Israel? To what extent is planning going on for this event?
I think in Israel, they're trying to keep the lid on the pressure cooker and trying to engage in low intensity conflict with a deterrent based strategy, which is basically what led to the incident of October 7th. Until they take the terror threat as seriously and go on an Operation Defensive Shield 3, which is going town by town, Palestinian city by Palestinian city, to clean out the weapons labs, the explosive laboratories, the arms caches which are there, and really to get rid of the violent threat that's there. They're not going to be able to seriously mitigate the threat enough as it's in the West Bank as it exists today. So once Gaza is done, they either have to turn their focus to Hezbollah in the north or to the West Bank in the east. I'm not sure when that will happen, but that's what is required in order to have a lasting peace there.
With so much arms and so many soldiers on the West Bank, what is your conclusion about why the West Bank, and perhaps Hezbollah as well, didn't join the attack from Gaza, or haven't joined it in the past 7 months?
I think there's a few reasons. The West Bank, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad leadership is decentralized. And it's a lot easier for Israel to have freedom of action there since they have forces deployed in both areas A, B, and C. That means in Palestinian civilian centers, that means in the towns which border major Palestinian populous centers, and also in the 60 to 65% of the West Bank where Israelis have freedom of movement. So the Israelis had a better intelligence network there on October 7th than they did with the 700 some soldiers that were surrounding Gaza, but with no real true human intelligence assets inside. The second reason, I think, is because there is still a modicum of cooperation with the Palestinian Authority and trying to not necessarily protect Israel's interests, but to protect the Palestinian kleptocratic interests of Mahmoud Abbas and his leadership. He does not see it in the PA's interest to launch an October 7th-like attack or to ignore one which would be launched by Hamas or Islamic Jihad, because he's pretty happy sitting in his fiefdom of Ramallah right now. And as you noted, he's 88 years old, and he wants to continue with that probably until the end of his life. And lastly, I think that the forces that are organized in Gaza were leading a serialized central government structure. You had one leader who was able to command all operations from his bunker. I'm talking about Yahya Sinwar. Unlike, like I said beforehand, the decentralized structure like you have in the West Bank. So as long as Israel is able to have full military control over the areas that they surround, they will be able to keep the lid on the pressure cooker until there's a point where the Palestinians are able to coordinate, or the PA decides it's had enough cooperation with Israel, it says enough is enough, and it turns its arms on Israel proper itself.
You know, one of the aspects of the negotiations in Gaza for some kind of ceasefire in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners and the return of the hostages has been a little noticed, I think, a demand by Hamas that any Palestinian prisoners who are released, which would be number in the thousands, uh, can go to the West Bank. They're not required to go to Gaza. So what you're talking about in terms of a possible agreement with Hamas is flooding the West Bank with Palestinians who will be sympathetic at a minimum to Hamas. In effect, you're staffing Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the West Bank. So how Gaza ends, I think, is going to affect how the next chapter in the West Bank begins. And I'm struck by your comments. It's so strange to be thinking of a Palestinian state or a two-state solution when nobody seems to have any confidence in elections in either Gaza or the West Bank. Very strange to have a state that cannot hold an election. Very strange for the United States, which is a democracy and presumably supporting democracy, not to want that to occur. So okay, let me turn to the two-state solution. What are your views on a three-state solution? The three states being Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Uh, the slogan of the peace process used to be two states living side by side in peace and security. We know Hamas and the Palestinian Authority can't really live side by side in peace and security. What about a three-state solution?
Hypothetically, you could have 3 states, 5 states, 10 states. I don't really think it's appropriate to have a conversation about a hypothetical until the people on the ground are ready to live side by side. This is a key point of a major project that we have at the Middle East Forum called the Israel Victory Project, or the Israel Victory Proposition. A book is actually coming out on this in June by Daniel Pipes that I hope all of your listeners will be able to have the opportunity to read. And that is that until Palestinian society is ready to reject their identity of being Palestinian as part and parcel being anti-Israel, the idea that the river to the sea concept comes into play, it's way too early to speak about the idea of a three-state solution. But let's play it out for a second. Let's say a majority of Gazans and a majority of West Bank Palestinians are ready to embrace the idea of living side by side with Israel. They can develop their own polity, society, economy, and culture on being Palestinian so long as it's devoid of Jew hatred and the idea that Israel will cease to exist. But until you get to that point, we're talking decades from now, until you can actually maybe have the possibility of states living side by side with each other.
Okay, let me turn to questions from the audience. We have quite a few here. The first one is from Skip Fisher. Absent U.S. pressure, do you think Israel could have finished off Hamas if allowed to do so by the international community?
I do think so. I think that there was 2 mistakes that Israel made. The first was that they did not go full bore into Rafah at the beginning of the operation. Back in 2008 and 2009, there was a 3-pronged pincer strategy where Israel attacked from the south, the center, and from the north. This time around, they only decided to hit Gaza City and Beit Haniya in the north of the Gaza Strip, and they let all the Hamas terrorists flow south. And then as soon as they went south, you saw all of them then started to come up north. And I think that the main idea here is that international community pressure started going in on it, and devoid of that pressure, Israel would have been able to finish off the job. The second mistake that it made is that it it engaged in these months-long negotiations with Hamas through Qatar. And instead of trying to finish off the Hamas cells, which were in Khan Yunis and at Rafah at the same time, they didn't have enough military pressure there. And now you see the dangers associated with this strategy, where you see Gaza neighborhoods like Jabalia, like Sharjah and Gaza City, where Hamas terrorists are coming out of their rat's nests and they're re-engaging in conflict against Israel by the dozens, if not the hundreds, rather than the tens that it thought it would have to deal with. So Israel should have put full pressure on if it had had the international community's support. But I think even without having the international community support, this conflict could have been wrapped up 4 months ago if it had not succumbed to U.S. pressure.
Mark Hager asks, if the trends of recent years continue, will the Palestinians in the West Bank become as radicalized as the Palestinians of Gaza? And is there a way to avoid this scenario?
The way to avoid it is to do the type of operation that I was speaking about beforehand. You have to root out Palestinian extremism. I'm not just talking about those who are under arms. Any official who engages in the denial of Israel's right to exist, any official, whether they be in a mosque or whether they be a leader in civil society, that is engaged in rejectionism of Israel's right to exist as a state and for the Jews to live side by side with the Palestinians, has to be taken off the board. Until that happens, the possibility of a Palestinian October 7th emanating from the West Bank is very real.
A question here from Lauren Adilev. She says, "Hi, I'm Israeli. Do you think the war in Gaza on the Lebanese border will end, or it's impossible as fundamentalism gets stronger from generation to generation of Arabs?"
If Netanyahu lets the IDF take the gloves off in Gaza, and right now there's a lot of hesitancy from the military war cabinet, the three ministers who can vote and the two who serve as observers in the security cabinet, keep on basically putting a political standstill with what Israel can actually do with its capabilities in Gaza, the war will keep on going there. Once Israel is able to root out the last vestiges of Hamas in Gaza, you'll move to a period of counterinsurgency and low-intensity conflict, very much like with what's going on in the West Bank right now. Hezbollah is a completely different story. Once Israel's able to turn its guns to the north, and I think it has to, and we'll talk about this in further podcasts, so I really don't want to focus too much on this. You're looking at a situation where a Islamist army proxy of Iran, armed with over 200,000 precision-guided munitions, will be able to launch thousands of rockets a day into Israel proper. And this isn't a war where you'll see Iron Dome and David Sling and the Arrow anti-missile systems knocking rockets out of the sky as Israeli troops invade Lebanon. You're looking at the possibility of skyscrapers falling and tens of thousands of casualties on the Israeli side. And until Israel makes the concrete decision to go into Lebanon and push Hezbollah back north of the Litani River, which is the area where they would have under UN Resolution 1701, I think that the possibility of war is very real. And until they have the political courage to finish the operation in Gaza and then finish Hezbollah in the north, war will continue.
He asked, why is Israel losing the media war, and what can they do about it?
Well, Israel always has this disadvantage of fighting like a boxer who's on his heels rather than on his toes. Israel has to contend with an international left that's against it. And frankly, most of the international media comes from the international far left. You also have to contend with the fact that Israel is always explaining itself rather than engaging in forward-thinking influence operations and psychological warfare. And lastly, when you have over 2,000 years of institutional anti-Semitism, regardless of who's in power or who the global power is, you have to deal with that. I think Israel needs to worry less about the media war and more about winning the war on the ground and creating new facts on the ground that the media will be forced to report.
Okay, Myra Yeager says only liberal German Jews can come up with the three-state solution. Do you believe Israel should give up its ancestral lands to Arabs?
I think that anything that brings peace to the region in this utopia that I guess the question posits is possible. But as I said beforehand, that conversation is decades away, if at all.
Okay, I probably not pronouncing his name correctly, but Yitzhak Levy says, is there a significant difference between how the current versus American administrations have managed sanctions on Iran, and how have these sanctions impacted Iran's ability to funnel funds and arms to the West Bank and other parts of the Ring of Fire?
I think if you look at four different administrations, those being of George Bush and of Donald Trump versus those of Barack Obama and Joe Biden, you'll see two significant differences in the strategies. Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaign led Iran to choke its economy. And at the end of the day, it went to China, where it was able to get billions of dollars in remittances for supplying China with tens of percentages of its oil supply. However, the rest of the Iranian economy was feeling the pain, and you had some of the most significant Iranian revolts go on during that time, whether it be over environmental strikes, water shortages, labor actions. And I think that the environment for dealing with Iran was better when you had a period of maximum pressure. The same thing could be said for the escalated sanctions under the Bush administration. However, when you started engaging in nuclear diplomacy with Iran and alleviating the mullahs from having economic sanctions on their economy, you started seeing an increase in the amount of money that was coming from Iran and funding its terror proxies. So the strategy that I would suggest is that you don't pay the Ayatollahs off, you keep maximum pressure on, and you allow the Iranian people to do the hard work of revolution rather than engaging in regime change yourself. You have to have a full suite of sanctions against them, and you have to fight back against their proxies. Otherwise, their danger will be perpetual, and they will continue in their ongoing effort to try to erase the Jewish state from the Middle East map.
There was a very long article in the New York Times Magazine this weekend on the issue of settler violence in the West Bank. I wonder what your analysis is of this question of the outbreak of violence between Palestinians and Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
I think it's the job of the IDF to keep the two separate. And as long as there is a disputed status over the West Bank, and there's hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians living there, next to millions of Palestinians, you're going to have some tension between the two. And I don't think that there was any statement that the Internal Security Minister, the National Security Minister, Ben-Gvir made, and I certainly don't agree with his policy that he said in yesterday's cabinet meeting. But he said, yes, political violence is a problem and has to be dealt with by the police and by the army, but the policy of giving humanitarian aid to Gaza is wrong. I think you do have to provide a minimal amount of humanitarian aid according to the Geneva Conventions and whatever is required under international law, but the minimum amount should be provided. So yes, there are a few bad apples on the Israeli side, but writ large, these are people who go to work, they live their lives, and frankly, they're the victims of Palestinian terrorism. 99% of the incidents which take place have to be dealt with because it's Palestinians who are starting the violence. But the 0.01 or the 0.02% that Israelis are responsible for, they have to be dealt with by the full force of the law. Everyone should be equal in terms of the carrying out of the law as it relates to violence against one another or robberies or vandalism. And I think the Israelis do a pretty good job at that.
Oh, we literally have only a minute left. Do you want to give us your thoughts about where the West Bank, what the situation will be in the West Bank 6 months from now?
Sure. I think that if Israel is able to finish its operation in Gaza, then it will turn north towards Hezbollah and continue with its conflict deconfliction strategy in the West Bank. But a day will come in the next year, or if forced by the death of Abu Mazen, that Israel will have to cast the dice on its policy in the West Bank and be able to deal with the emanating violence from it. For more information about this, you can go to meforum.org, which is our organization's website, and tune in to the next 5 webinars.
Okay, thank you all for joining us today. The next of the third of these sessions will be not next Monday, which is Memorial Day, but the Monday after that, June 3rd, with Daniel Pipes. Encourage all of you to rejoin us. And thank you, Gregg, for a very informative presentation.
Thank you, Rick.
Bye-bye.